And we're live. It is Tuesday, December 1st, 2020, 5:01 p.m. And I have spent the last hour and a half to 2 hours frantically trying to figure out what Bill Barr has been up to. I have not made intense progress, but I have probably made more progress than many of you. So I am going to spend a couple of minutes just describing the latest machinations of our Attorney General as today's monologue. As you have probably seen on various news services, the Attorney General back in October appointed John Durham, who is the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut and has been conducting a investigation of the investigators. He appointed him to do the exact same thing, but as a special counsel, which you will recall is the precise office that Bob Mueller held. He did so, in fact, with a mandate to investigate, among other things, the conduct of Bob Mueller. So his mandate includes the special counsel is authorized to investigate whether any federal official, employee, or any other person or entity violated the law in connection with the intelligence, counterintelligence, or law enforcement activities directed at the 2016 presidential campaigns, individuals associated with those campaigns, and individuals associated with the administration of President Donald J. Trump, including but not limited to Crossfire Hurricane, which is the code name of the FBI original Russia investigation, and the investigation of Special Counsel Robert S. Mueller III. So in other words, this is now a special counsel investigation to investigate, among other things, the last special counsel investigation. Now, I know what you're asking. You're asking, wait a minute, what laws might plausibly have been violated? And the answer, of course, is, well, we know of one, which is the lawyer Kevin Kleinsmith, who has pled guilty to falsifying a document. And as to the other subjects, we have no idea what this could be about, because there has been, to my knowledge, no allegation of consequence anyway. There's lots of people throwing around the word treason and coup and that. But nobody has alleged that any of the principals involved in the, or even the line attorneys, or with the exception of Kevin Kleinsmith, did anything illegal. And so that is one very good question. But there's another very good question about this, which is, wait a minute, I thought, and I know that some of you are thinking about this, that I thought that 28 CFR 600.3 said that when you appoint a special counsel, it has to be somebody from outside the Justice Department. Remember, Bob Mueller wasn't a Justice Department official when he was appointed under the special counsel regs. He was a guy practicing law at WilmerHale. And so this is where the situation gets kind of sticky. The reason to appoint him, the reason to do this is to make it difficult to fire him, so that Joe Biden cannot get into office and say, we're not doing this shit anymore. The new Attorney General curtails the Durham investigation, and that's the end of it. Under the special counsel rules, you can only fire somebody for good cause. And so if you've appointed him under the special counsel rules, it's pretty hard to fire him, and he's going to get to finish his investigation. The trouble is that if you appoint him under the special counsel rules, this gets tricky here, then you've appointed him illegally, because in fact 600.3 does say the special counsel will be appointed from outside the Justice Department. And John Durham is the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut. He is not outside the Justice Department. He's a current Justice Department employee. So Bill Barr did something extremely clever in this order. He appointed him not under the special counsel rules, and then applied the special counsel rules to the investigation in the same order, except the rule that restricts him from appointing people to from inside the Justice Department. This is very clever. It's good lawyering by Bill Barr, but it's not good enough. And the reason is that the next Attorney General can come in and say, that's very cute, but if you didn't appoint him under the special counsel rules, you appointed him under your generic authority, I can unappoint him under the generic authority, or even I can extend your order to include those rules that you left out and thereby make clear that his appointment was improper. So what does any of this matter? The answer is it does make it politically more difficult to end the Durham investigation if that's what the next Attorney General wants to do. If the next Attorney General wants to end the Durham investigation, it doesn't prevent that. It's not. It's Quite doable. It makes it more politically difficult to do it. And it creates, as a confirmation matter, I think, a opportunity for Republican senators to demand of an Attorney General nominee that he or she protect the Durham investigation. So it's a clever move by Bill Barr. It will lengthen the endless scrutiny that people who are not plausibly alleged to have done anything unlawful have to deal with. It will not result in any prosecutions of anybody, I don't believe. And it's another reason to think that Bill Barr is not playing with an honest deck. We are not allowed to have fun anymore. And but in lieu of fun, we are allowed to talk about taxes, which does seem like the kind of thing that you do instead of having fun. And so since they've had to suffer through me yapping about Bill Barr for now 7.5 minutes, I want to extend a warm welcome to my Brookings colleague, Vanessa Williamson, who is my guru on all things tax policy, and to our second Molly of the week. This is the we don't usually have multiple Mollies per week on In Lieu of Fun. But I should have asked you this, Molly, before we started, but is your last name pronounced Michelmore?
No, it's Michelmore, as if there were a T in there.
Wow.
Yeah, nobody gets it right.
That would not have been my guess. So Molly Michelmore, who is like a tax historian, which is like the coolest thing, at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia, the home of 2 Confederate generals and 2 small universities packed in there, not too far from the cabin in the woods. Welcome to the show to you both. I just want to start with question. I'm going to frame the question so that it's how do you become a historian of taxes? And for that matter, Vanessa, of all the things to be a policy wonk about, it's almost like a policy wonk's policy wonk is the tax code and people's attitude toward taxes. How'd you guys get into this racket?
So I'll go first. After college, I worked on the Hill for a little while. I started off basically as, a staff assistant, taking calls. And it seemed to me that, 9 times out of 10, people would call and they would say, as a taxpayer and a citizen, I demand that you do X. as a taxpayer and a citizen, it didn't matter, right, what they were asking for. It could have been sort of left-wing nuns asking you to shut down the School of the Americas. I was working in the late 90s. Or it could have been sort of folks from the right wing asking you to defund Social Security. But they often preface these sort of questions with, as a taxpayer and a citizen. And so that was in the back of my mind when I went to graduate school. And I was interested in working on the welfare state. And it seemed to me, just in reading through all the literature, that people talked a lot about what you spent, but they didn't talk about how you paid for what you spent. And so that's how I kind of backed into tax history, because it really was kind of understudied at the time that I was getting into it.
Vanessa? I've just like, you've been like a tax person as long as I've known you. How did it happen? You love taxes.
I love a tax, man. I love a tax. I love the two bad taxes, the poll tax and the tax on groceries. Every other tax I'm kind of in favor of. Actually, my story is in some ways similar, which is I came into the tax work because I wrote a book on the Tea Party, and I was really struck by how often very conservative people would describe themselves as taxpayers. And, it's a weird thing to sort of stand on because it's, mandatory and therefore not, it doesn't make you special, like in a really fundamental way. It's an extremely universal experience. And so I was interested in it actually because I was attending the tax day rally, the Tea Party rally in 2009. Yes, I think that's right. And in Boston, and there was a woman who got on stage and was talking about, she'd lost her son in Iraq, and she was talking about that sacrifice. And before I went to graduate school, I worked for 6 years for a veterans organization for Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. And so, this is a story that really resonates. That experience is something that it doesn't touch my life personally, but I know a lot of people for whom it has. And she was talking about the sacrifices she'd made and how she'd given up so much for this country. And then she segued immediately into the taxes she'd paid. And it kind of blew my mind a little bit because the level of sacrifice she'd made for the country is to me almost unimaginable, whereas I also pay taxes all the time and almost never think about it. So, and I certainly don't take it as a very, I don't feel that any great burden has been placed on me by those taxes. And so I realized there was something going on here that I really wanted to understand. And so that it became part of the Tea Party book. And then, as I looked into it further, Molly's exactly right. It's not limited to the conservative side at all. The frequency with which people tell you, oh, I'm a taxpayer, and therefore, and the end of the sentence is not about taxes. Basically, and not never, but real close, it's about all these other things that they think government should do, about how they deserve to be respected by their fellow citizens. So people act a little bit like taxes are boring, which I think is terrible, because then you ask them like one question about taxes and they are incensed, or they have so much to say, it's so emotional. And so, I never look back.
How do you explain that? I mean, you have everybody thinks taxes are boring, and everybody has really strong feelings about them. Resolve that for me.
I think I'd love to hear what Molly has to say about it, but I think there's two things going on. It's detailed and confusing, and that feels a little bit like boring, but it's also a very fundamental part of contributing to one's society and to one's country, and it taps immediately into whether one thinks the government works for them, right? Because if you pay taxes and you think you're getting like good stuff back, like you're like, my roads are great, my school is great, the healthcare system is great. If you think all those things, then people tend to be like, taxes, that's okay. Or if you think I'm chipping in and it's expensive, but what, everyone else is chipping in too, that's okay. But when you don't feel one of those things, when you don't think government works for you, or when you don't think other people are chipping in fairly, you get real angry. So I think that, just the details of it are like a little, no one really wants to, not that many people actually like filing their taxes, and I am not among those people anyway. But the experience of taxpaying is deep stuff about patriotism, about community, in my opinion.
So, and this kind of is, I'm kind of twitching over here because for a bunch of reasons. One, we started off on Sunday with one of my good friends. I teach property law. One of my good friends, and I teach internet law. Everyone's always interested in the internet law stuff, but it's actually like whenever I start talking about it, becomes deep, like it's about governance, and it becomes deeply boring, and they glaze over. But like what no one realizes is how interesting the property law stuff is, and it touches on everyone. And there's these just completely batshit stories about what people do to each other and all of this kind of stuff. I feel lately that like the same is true of tax. I have started to look at it as a mechanism for like social justice and wealth redistribution and incentivizing good behaviors, or like, I mean, even though that sounds paternalistic or is paternalistic, like all of these different things which people have talked about or not talked about, maybe always in that type of language around tax for years. Like I was just like, and so I have a lot of questions in that area, but I was particularly first thinking kind of about when I was taking revolutionary American history in college. And at some point I remember I was with a study group and I just was like kind of demonstrating, and I was like, no, it wasn't just taxation without representation. It was taxation without representation. Like, and it like, there's a phrase that just gets chanted over and over again that it almost becomes kind of, you forget like the core of what it means, almost like it's like a genericide of a word or a term. Like, I feel like you don't actually sit down and think about the fact that, and this is what I was going to say, there's one other thing that really gets people incensed, is if they're giving up their money and they have no say over the policies that the institution that they're giving their money to, like as to like how that money is used. So anyways, I just was kind of thinking that there's this really deep kind of normative background, cultural background built around taxes. And I am just so curious why, as Ben kind of led this conversation with, like how that becomes a story that's so like dry and gets boiled down to the mundane. Like, I know, I'm serious. I mean, like, you just think of like the pencil neck guy in his like button down short sleeve shirt, you know, like with his like, you know, pencil, like, you know, sharpening his pencils and like a little like calculator. Right. And that's not what it is at all. It can, you know, it can really be a means of incredible social justice reform. So thoughts on how that developed historically, how it went from being like a revolutionary cause to it kind of the cultural iconography of taxes is like basically pocket lint.
I mean, I'm going to toss that one to Molly. You use the word historically. There's no way I can answer that first.
Sorry,
There's
Molly.
No
Oh, you're muted, Molly.
I've unmuted you. Wait,
Oh,
Molly's muted too. Molly, why are you? No, it's not on your headset. It's
on our end.
Yeah, look on. Hover over the top of your screen, your window, and you'll see a mute, a toggle mic option. Unclick it. It's not unclicking. All right, Vanessa, why don't you talk about this? I'm going to
believe
remove.
you're going to make me talk
I'm going to
about history.
remove
No.
Molly from the screen and bring her back, and this will solve the problem.
Political scientist, you be quiet. You don't know anything.
No. Talk about it in contemporary terms.
No. Actually, I mean, it's interesting. I'm writing a new book that it talks about the revolutionary period and about tax paying.
I think Molly's back and unmuted.
Hooray! Are you good?
Can y'all hear me now?
Yes.
Indeed.
Excellent. I'm not hearing you through my headphones.
Tech difficulties are just part of it.
As long as you can hear me.
We roll with that shit.
So we were talking about how taxes became boring.
Yeah. Because the founders didn't think of them as boring.
No, the founders didn't think of them as boring. I think they get sort of, kind of brought into this technocratic space beginning in the post-World War I period, where it becomes the domain of a kind of rising claque of experts in the Treasury and in kind of politicized economics departments in places like the University of Wisconsin. And it becomes about rates and marginal utility and all of those sorts of boring things, as opposed to the sort of sexier kind of traditions of social justice or citizenship or who belongs and who doesn't. And so it gets boiled down into
to like
the
the
kind of
quantitative empirics. It was a move to the quantitative empirics, basically, you think, of like taxes. Like, was that an academic move, like a discipline move?
I think so. And I would have to sort of, look further into this kind of moment in the 1920s when I think this happens. And I just reviewed an article for a journal kind of on this moment. But I think it does have to do with the development of economics as a profession, as well as the kind of professionalization of tax experts in this moment.
So fascinating.
Yeah, I think there's a whole move towards sort of separating, the sort of move to separate economics from politics, both as a field of study and as how we sort of imagine. We imagine that the economy is somehow happening outside of our governing structure, and yet it is governed by laws. And I think that sometimes can make things that are really political issues, like really about power and citizenship, seem like something that's just a series of tables.
All right. So I want to go back to the founding era and ask you, Molly, the American suspicion of taxation, we talk about it as though it's a Reaganite Tea Party thing. It's really old. And I think it was Madison who wrote that the power to tax is the power to destroy, which is admittedly a bit overwrought, but is like no joke. There's a serious historical depth to the American concern about taxation. And we're now in an environment in which, we are outspending, even before COVID, we're outspending our income by $1 trillion a year. So it's like it's a no joke disparity between the way we see ourselves and the way we actually live as a government. And so my question is, how deeply rooted is it? Is it, something that ebbs and flows? Is it something that we're subject to persuasion about? Or is it a matter that we're basically, there's something about Americans and taxation that we really, have a problem in this area, kind of like guns?
Oh, sorry. That was the former president of Estonia.
Yeah, I'm trying to bring in
that's not a joke. He was going to come in to talk about.
I'm trying to bring in Tomas Ilves to as a counterpoint but we're having a little bit of a technical problem with him. But just talk as though the former president of Estonia wasn't occasionally flitting up on your screen. This is the way we roll here, and so. Like give us a sense of how exceptional we are in this regard.
That's a good question. I have no idea.
Vanessa, you want to take that, or do you want me to try?
I'll do some bits and I'll forget some bits. You do some bits. So I think that one of the really interesting things about the history of tax opposition in the United States is that a very large part of it is rooted in tax opposition in the South, and specifically the tax opposition of slaveholders, because taxation touches so much of life. It is basically the government's assertion of power over property, right? And so at the founding of the United States, there was a region of the country that had a very different form of property, right? Human chattel, slavery. So the response of slaveholders, a book by Robin Einhorn that I'd highly recommend is American Taxation, American Slavery, which lays this argument out, I think, very clearly. The response of American slaveholders to modestly democratic government as they conceived of it, representative government, was to limit the government's taxing power. And they did that at a federal level. and they did it in their own states. So part of the history, I think we tend to confound a little bit the sort of the revolutionary moment, which certainly included opposition to taxation or any form of legislation from Britain, and this other current in American history, which is certainly, they're coterminous. But for example, if we think about the Boston Tea Party, it was in opposition to a tax cut. Little known, but what happened was Britain wanted to give preferential rates to the East India Company, and in exchange, they wanted to do that and also give them monopoly power to trade in the American colonies, and the American colonies didn't like that, right? But we
because they had local other people that they were trading with.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear that this is smuggling from the British perspective,
right?
But yeah, sure, local merchants. But yeah, so there's a tendency to. Yeah, exactly, right? So, what could be remembered as a sort of anti-monopolistic aspect of American history, which there is also a very long tradition of in this country, is sort of wrapped into a story about Americans constantly being anti-tax. But the real history of anti-tax politics, like the reason that the federal government's capacity to impose direct taxation is so limited, the reason there needed to be an income tax amendment to have an income tax at all, that all stems from the decision of slaveholders who were very frightened of the possibility that abolition could occur through taxation. Molly, the whole 20th century. That's you, man. I don't. That's not me.
I think that's right. That we can't really separate this attitude towards taxation from the story of slavery and the kind of fallout from slavery in the post-Civil War period. That there was a resistance to the kind of governmental power that could be exercised by a well-funded national state. And largely that was about sort of infringing on Southern states' prerogatives to organize their economy, organize their racialized economy in the ways that they wanted to. And so to try and disentangle the history of race and the history of, American anti-tax attitudes is an impossible task.
So quick follow-up before we go to Tomas. Is it true, Molly, if there had been a greater funded federal government, like the greater the federal government was funded, the more the Southern states basically resisted that because they felt like it could come in and crush any rebellion? Or was it kind of like, I guess, like you could also think of like one of the ways that the South was so destroyed by being cut off from the North was the fact that they didn't have all of the economy. And so there could be some redistribution by the federal government in theory to help them. I don't know, but like I'm trying to just kind of think of both sides of how that would have played out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. And of course, when we're talking about a really kind of robust federal tax regime, we're not talking about anything before 1913 and really kind of 1917, when World War I really kind of blows up the size of the federal income tax.
Yes.
And of course, the South was always in a sort of weird position vis-a-vis the federal government, because on the one hand, they needed help. They didn't have any money. They were, right, as a federal report said in 1931 or 1932, right, the nation's #1 economic problem. At the same time, they were really very much dependent on a racialized labor system and very much afraid of any kind of federal intervention that's going to mess around with that.
All right. Tomas, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I'm assuming you can because your thumbs are up. This feels like a kind of Marshall McLuhan kind of moment, Woody Allen, Annie Hall thing, where I have a former head of state in a different country right here, and I want your perspective on whether Americans are just insane about taxes or whether there is something sort of universal about the American suspicion of taxation. Are we speaking, in our tax suspicion for a universal value, or do Estonians just kind of accept in a communitarian way that if you want government to do things, you got to pay for it?
Well, first of all, the U.S. is already completely bizarre, along with it and some other developing country, the only ones with extraterritoriality on taxes. If you live abroad in most countries, in fact, about 200 of them, you pay taxes where you live. Whereas when I was still a U.S. citizen and worked in Munich at Radio Free Europe, I had over a certain sum, I had to pay then taxes also to the U.S. government. I was like, okay, well, I mean, I didn't want to get arrested, so I paid my taxes. So that's very bizarre because elsewhere, I mean, a good example is Canada, where if you move abroad, you don't pay taxes. You also don't have the right to vote. Most countries actually have the right to vote abroad, even if you don't, because you pay taxes elsewhere. Now,
But did you get a stimulus check, Tomas?
I don't get a stimulus check.
Okay.
But more importantly, Estonia was the first country after the collapse of communism to go over to a flat rate income tax, which at the time was 26%. Now we've reduced it to 20%. And we actually have across the board flat rate income tax. It's 20% personal income tax, 20% VAT, which is a concept no one in America understands. Well, I mean, I don't know. Do you understand it?
Our guests understand it.
And 3, we have a 20% corporate income tax on dividends, not on profits, which is something that, I mean, was clearly important in the beginning of independence in the first 15 years or so, because why the hell would you tax a company if it reinvested its profits into building its business? And since our goal, and sort of coming out of the Soviet Union, was to build up a system in which companies reinvested. Much more important for us and in general is the fact that 99% of the population pays income tax online. And that means that, I mean, when you pay your taxes, it is all filled out for you. Everything you've made, every deduction you get, every donation to the Boy Scouts or the Estonian Lutheran Church, it's all there. It's all done for you. And you look at it, and then you, after 3 minutes, if takes that long to look at it, you press enter, and your taxes are done, and you get your money right away, your refund right away. If you pay it on paper, filling out your taxes, as in the United States, well, first of all, it takes you hours and hours, and secondly, it takes you months and months to get your refund.
And I assume all of this is dependent on the larger digital identity issue.
Write it out. Anyway, all I'm saying is as soon as we digitized, we had a hockey stick of compliance rates. And it just went whoop, because as soon as you have to do that online, it just becomes very difficult to cheat. 2 things. One is that our southern neighbor, which has a 70% larger population than we do, Latvia, which is more or less the same GDP per capita, but it is 70% larger, and with more or less the same tax rates, received 15% less in tax revenue than we did in 2015. That's a big deal. I mean, they're 70% larger, and they should be getting a lot more, and they got less, 15% less.
And wait, you're saying, just to be clear, you're saying that's because of online collection?
Well, I'm not there yet.
Online filing? Oh, yes. Sorry. Okay.
So
sorry.
we have our southern neighbor had at the time 400% or 4 times as many in the tax bureau, and they were collecting in a country 70% larger, 50% less taxes, and it's simply because people just pay taxes in Estonia because you can't get away with it. Where we have gone now is an AI system for corporate income tax, where instead of filing your you're doing your company reports quarterly, it's done online, and anything over 750 euros or about $800, you have to can only file digitally. And the AI will look at what you're getting in and what you're paying out, because it's all online, And since our goal is that our companies do not go bankrupt, if you're not doing well, they call you in, they say, well, why don't we do an arrangement and you can stagger your taxes or something. Because the whole idea of our taxation system is that we are a service to residents, not something just to screw you. Anyway, that's how we work.
But do people have a
It's
sense
very
of like,
different from what
do
most-
people have a sense of entitlement around taxes or rights that are tax based? Like, do you hear people yelling about kind of like, kind of Molly?
I don't think
about-
Tomas can hear you. I'm gonna dismiss him, and we are going to, and now he'll be able to hear again, and we're going to. I want Vanessa's reaction to this. How much of this is doable in the United States? If you had a system, and Molly, I am having trouble unmuting you again, so I'm going to remove you once more and bring you in back while Vanessa is talking. How much of this is doable in the United States? If we had a system that was, you were filing online directly to the IRS, it was largely done for you, and there was a kind of AI examination of who should be audited. How much of this is like replicable here, and how much of this works because Tomas ran a country with 1.3 million people who have high degrees of social cohesion?
So that last point really gets to the heart of it. From a technical and logistic perspective, this is not difficult at all. Many of us file our taxes online, right? We just use a private service to do so, usually, although not exclusively. The IRS already knows if you work for wages or salary. The IRS in general already knows how much you make. And in many countries, the way it would work, if your circumstances change in a way that the government wouldn't know about, then you just file an amendment, so that you would basically do your taxes in the years where the government didn't get it right. And that's a very common system worldwide. Obviously, we have the technical capacity to do that kind of thing. What we may not have is the political capacity to do it, as is true on so many issues these days, I think. And specifically, while it would benefit everyone to a substantial degree to not have to file your taxes, or to only file them if you want to make an amendment to what the government thinks you owe, it would be a huge time saver and save literally billions of dollars of Americans' time every year. It would be an enormous cost to a narrow industry. The Intuits and TurboTaxes of the world, the H&R Blocks of the world, do not like the idea of it being easy to file your taxes with the government doing that work for you, because that is their business model to do that work, right? And so one of the reasons we don't have a system that other countries do is because when places have tried to implement it, in California, they tried to implement Ready Return, and briefly they experimented with it for a few years. Well, it got crushed because there was very heavy lobbying by the tax preparation industry to prevent the government from doing something it could easily do and simplify your life, because their business model involves your life not being simple. So on the one hand, technically, obviously, this is no particular challenge in a modern, in the contemporary economy, to have online filing that is handled primarily by the government, in the same way that there's no technical reason it's difficult to have the government handle voter registration. We don't have the political will for that, for different reasons, obviously, on those two issues. But not having the political will is a way of saying something's not possible, right? Now, maybe, of course, that can change. But that, I think, is, at least on the question of tax preparation, it's very much the political clout of a small industry.
I think I would only add to that there's also the Republican Party has redefined itself in some ways as the anti-tax party in the last 45 to 50 years. And they have a vested interest in people hating all parts of paying taxes. And so if taxes were simplified, if tax collection was an example of the government doing its job well, then in some ways that's very antithetical to the kind of mission of a modern GOP that's redefined itself as the sort of anti-tax party.
One other question about this, one of the things Tomas said is they were one of the first countries to really go to a flat tax system. the objections to flat tax systems in this country come from the left, not from the right. Is the left getting this wrong, and that the degree of simplicity and actually is worth the degree of regressivity, or that the regressiveness can be handled in ways other than, a highly complicated tax system, through subsidies for things, for example, or through, whatever you want to do. But there's something really valuable about saying, hey, the tax rate is blank, and that's the government's take.
So I think that, it's funny because as you described a flat tax, you then added subsidies, which complexify it again. So, I think it's a little bit of a
well, it's not the tax hit, that's the expenditure side.
It's just the complexity of the tax code's not in the rates. The rates are a relatively small series of brackets. Now, I'll be absolutely upfront with you that Americans, as a general rule, do not understand what marginal taxation is. And one of the reasons there's a concern about progressive taxation is because people imagine if you get bumped into the next bracket, you'll actually take home less pay, right? But of course, the bracket only applies to the income above the previous level. But that's hard to explain. So people don't know that, and it is a thing that concerns people. But the complexity of the tax code is not in the brackets. The complexity is in everything else, and there's no reason a flat tax would simplify that. Now, people do prefer taxes that feel simple to them, right? Like a sales tax, which is, again, not especially simple on the implementation side. The things that get included in sales taxes or excluded, those are actually, detailed, complicated issues. But people prefer them because they're simple to pay. So what people like is simple to pay, and simple to pay stands in for, easy to understand a lot of the time.
So this is perfect segue to the thing that I ask every person that I ever come across who's an expert in tax. So lucky you. Which is basically, we've kind of talked around this idea. There's various ways that you can think of like taxes as like what their job is to do. If the job is to simply taxation is to simply fund government activity, then that's fine. But we haven't talked about taxes that way in a very long time. In fact, we talk about taxes almost entirely in terms of incentivizing or de-incentivizing certain types of behavior. And so in that sense, what my question is to you is like, we've talked about subsidies, we've talked about taxes, we've talked about, what we haven't talked about is fines. And what we also haven't talked about is sanctions. And I'm really curious why something like a Pagovian tax isn't a fine. And just to be clear, a Pagovian tax is when a person who wants to smoke cigarettes, for example, pays extra. Like there is a tax that is taxed on to your cigarette pack when you buy it, that basically is a flat tax that is supposed to like offset the externalities of you smoking and giving other people lung cancer and polluting the environment and whatever else. And so that is a tax that should disincentivize some people from smoking and then also pay for the harms that behavior like creates, right? So I'm like, I hope that was a correct kind of summary of Pagovian taxes. But what that always has struck me as is like a fine for smoking. And this is a kind of a double negative question. Like why do we conceive of some things as taxes and why do we conceive of some things as fines? And why do we talk about things in terms of subsidies or refunds when it was our money all along or whatever else?
There was a lot in that question. Molly, do you want to go first?
I'm really sorry.
Your parts, and I'll.
Well, I'm not sure that I have a particularly good answer to those particular questions, but you're absolutely right that, we use the tax code to do a lot of things apart from raising money to do the basic business of government. And that in the 20th century, it became a tool to disincentivize certain behaviors and to incentivize others. So we incentivize marriage, we incentivize home ownership, we incentivize, a whole bunch of different things. We incentivize employers giving health insurance to their employees. And so it becomes in some ways an alternative to building out a more robust welfare state, because we do all of these things that you could do directly through spending, indirectly through what we think of as tax expenditures or tax spending. And there are sort of complicated political reasons for that. Basically, it's easier, right? There is this kind of turn against the state that comes in the 1960s and 1970s, and it becomes easier to do the things sort of that you wanted to do by doing it through the tax code, because you can sell it as a tax cut to some people, and you can sell it as a social good to other people. But it does make everything complicated. And ultimately, it does sort of undermine, I think, sort of social cohesion and sort of faith in the state and faith in sort of government to do the right thing.
Yeah, I'll add just a little bit to that. I think that when we rely on sort of indirect, like sort of bank shot social policy through the tax code, it makes it harder for Americans to know what's happening. So one of the effects is that people don't notice that sometimes these things are very regressive. The classic example of that is the home mortgage interest deduction, which is a very big incentive for people who have good jobs and large houses and have a lot of housing wealth, which means in America, predominantly white people. And people don't recognize that because it's sort of built into the tax code in a way that if you were sending larger checks to rich people and small checks to poorer people, it'd be more obvious that this was a really regressive way to do policy, but it's not so obvious in the tax code. So that's one thing. The thing I'd say about fees and fines. So at a state level, it's become harder to raise taxes for lots of reasons, largely sort of the aftermath of the Reagan Revolution. And so one of the effects of that is because we don't raise taxes that are predicated on the idea they're based on people's ability to pay, we rely more heavily at a state level on fees and fines. And fees and fines are the flattest of taxes and therefore extremely regressive. If it's $250, it's $250 if you're a millionaire. It's $250 if you're like you have $10,000, annual income.
And there's so much incredible research on this about how incredibly disproportionate this is against people that are working two jobs, that are from marginalized communities, that they get policed harder, and that there's more kind of like desperation and kind of breaking or bending the rules because of the circumstances that they're in. All of these things.
Yeah, because you end up with a fiscal incentive for localities to over-police poor people. And that's over-policing Black neighborhoods a lot of the time. And so, I mean, if you look at the DOJ's report on what happened in Ferguson, one of the things that they identify, the Civil Rights Division identifies as a problem, is that this was a cash cow, pulling people over. And then getting them into sort of cycles of court fees and debts that you could never get out of. And you weren't even told when you're supposed to be in court, and then there was an added fine because you didn't show up. Those sorts of things, right? But all of that kept the city flush, and it allowed them to keep things like property taxes low. And the people who are really angry about property taxes are people with a lot of money. So
you tied it all together, bringing it back to property.
Kate teaches property.
I know I said that already. Yeah. No. Is Molly? Has that been how it's been happening? Kind of in the era of especially white flight and like kind of the segregation of America in a post kind of. I'm gonna say broadly post Civil War and then post Reconstruction and then kind of post 1950s like World War II kind of era. Has that all just kind of happened again and again, but on built up over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially since property taxes usually sort of primarily used to fund public schools in the sort of post-Brown era, there's a great deal of resistance to continuing to pay property taxes for schools that white homeowners didn't want to send their kids to because they were desegregated. And as Vanessa said, the sort of Reagan Revolution and the aftermath of Prop 13 in California and then Prop 1 in Massachusetts and this sort of, or Prop 3.5 rather, this sort of nationwide tax revolt, there is this real reluctance on the part of state and local officials to raise their taxes and this kind of search for revenue elsewhere, right? And a lot of that revenue can be found in these, for some people, penny ante fines and fees, but for people who don't have the resources to pay for them, it becomes a real problem. And there is a lot of interesting research kind of linking that search for resources among states and localities to the carceral state and the sort of, the mass incarceration crisis.
Oh my gosh. We're talking about everything but taxes over here, Ben.
Taxes are everything, I think is what Vanessa and I are saying.
All right, let's go to audience questions. I am inviting some audience members in, not necessarily in the order in which they have been upvoted, because I think Gowan DeLeo has the kick-ass question of the day, but the Big Blue blogger beat him to the screen. So, Big Blue, you get the first question.
Thanks, Ben. I'm back in blue today. We fixed the lighting. Vanessa, Molly, I don't care what anybody says. I think your topic is fascinating. I'd love to sit and have a beer with either of you anytime. My question actually is about wealth taxes. I'm a straight white moderate Klobuchar down the middle Democrat, but I did find myself during the primary campaign having feelings for Elizabeth Warren, and I'm kind of wealth tax curious. But my reservation is whether they're collectible, whether they're practical, whether it's just a boon for the tax avoidance industry. What do you think?
Great question.
Vanessa, I'm going to give you this one.
Super good question.
Yeah, I think that, the income tax seemed uncollectible once upon a time. And so I think that obviously it would require an immense investment in the IRS, because currently the IRS is barely able to do the tax collection it's already been assigned to do. And because it's underfunded, and for other reasons, it tends to focus on collecting money from the poor, right? It's already not going after wealthy people. Because it's harder, obviously, to disentangle, say, Donald Trump's taxes, to pick like the most obvious example, rather than like send an angry letter to a single mom in Louisiana and have her not be confident she did her taxes right, and then not get her EITC. So without enormous investment in the IRS, I don't think a wealth tax is possible. Without enormous investment in the IRS, I don't think a fair tax system is possible. But that aside, I'm relatively confident that the problem of the wealth tax is a political will rather than any kind of technical capacity.
Gowan DeLeu, I cannot bring you on screen because your webcam is off, or at least so seems to be from here, but we can hear you. Okay. And you have the killer question of the day. So the floor is yours.
Is it the last one?
Your Laffer curve question.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So is the Laffer curve in any way connected to reality?
I love like the slow.
I mean, insofar as
let me amplify that for a minute, because I've been fixated on Gowan's question for years, not fixated enough to do any research and find out the answer, mind you, but fixated enough to scratch my head about it. If marginal tax rates were 100%, you would have no investment. So at some level, Laffer's observation that there is a curve has to be right. But everything I know about the history of increasing and decreasing taxes suggests that he's drawing the curve in entirely the wrong place. So for both of you, I don't know who this is better directed to, how should we understand what is right and what is wrong about the Laffer curve?
Well, I mean, I think you got it. So theoretically, right, the Laffer curve is sort of obvious. At 0 tax rate at 100%, you're not going to collect anything, right? Because either the government's not going to raise any money or nobody's going to work. And so that's clear. But sort of what that curve looks like is not clear. And what we know from history is that every time the sort of lessons of the Laffer curve have been applied, right, in supply side economics, either at the national level or at the state level in Kansas, it hasn't worked. It hasn't done what it's supposed to do. It hasn't sort of spurred economic activity to such an extent that federal revenues or state revenues actually increase. So the empirical evidence, right? And you can see how people might believe this when Laffer came up with it in the 1970s. The economy was collapsing and the sort of economics profession couldn't figure out why and couldn't figure out how to fix it. And so there was this moment where new ideas and new solutions might make sense. But we now have 45, 50 years of the Laffer curve not working. And so I feel confident saying that no, right? It never really worked. And we have the sort of historical and economic evidence to back that up.
Vanessa?
Molly did answer that brilliantly. I would add only one thing, which is that when we're thinking about the impact of marginal tax rates, one of the value of top tax rates is that it reduces rent seeking. We sometimes, I think, wrongly imagine that all the income earned at the very top goes to productivity. I mean, there's a lot of, frankly, there's really tons and tons of evidence that's not the case. So when, one of the things
of real property.
One of the things that happens with higher tax rates is it discourages things like corporate boards rewarding CEOs for things that the CEO wasn't responsible for. For industry-wide changes, that sort of, so things where it's sort of an old boys network, when people pat each other on the back and everyone pays each other more in like a small echelon of society, that having high marginal tax rates makes it expensive to do that, right? Because if you want to increase your CEO's pay, and there's a 90% tax rate, you're going to have to increase it 10 times more just to give him that little bonus, right? So I think when we're thinking about the implications of high marginal tax rates, we've got to think about the Pigouvian value of those taxes, right?
Yeah, what would be happening to that money otherwise?
Wait, why did you laugh when you said that? Does no one talk about Pigouvian taxes anymore, and I'm totally out of date or something?
No, it's just they don't usually talk about it in terms of the income tax. I think Molly, am I wrong here? The phrase was in my head because it's used all the time, but for things like smoking. But yeah, I think we need to take into account that there are other things that we would like to disincentivize about our economy.
Yeah.
John Bordeaux, you get the penultimate question today, although it's only sort of the penultimate question, because I have the actual last question for Vanessa, which is separate. And Kate has the merch situation, and we got to discuss before we act. But the penultimate audience question is yours.
I'm glad you qualified that. First of all, thanks for doing this, guys. I don't know if you know the show well enough to know that it's an extraordinary compliment to the two of you that it took us 47 minutes to realize Ben was wearing a dog shirt again. It's a thing. My question
I love that dog shirt. I have it.
It's my favorite dog shirt. It's one of my favorite dog shirts.
He has many. I'm sorry. I guess my question was, we've talked around this the whole time here that the narrative in this country is taxation is theft. And what is the way to shift that narrative to say what is sort of obvious to people that study the topic, that they're actually patriotic, they build communities? And John Edwards actually augmented this and asked a more fundamental question. Why does investment seem to be an alien concept in the public sphere, I'll add, in America? How do you shift this narrative?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 trillion question. Of course, Vanessa's research finds that a lot of people do find that paying taxes is a kind of fundamental obligation of citizenship. They feel proud to have paid those taxes. But of course, we do have a kind of political situation in which a sort of opposition to taxes is yoked to opposition to certain kinds of spending. And again, this sort of brings us back to Vanessa's initial point about slavery and Jim Crow and sort of the politics of race in the United States, is that there is, I think, this linkage between tax resistance and resistance to spending on certain kinds of people and on certain kinds of programs. And you can certainly see that in kind of 20th century American history, if you look at the sort of politics of the welfare queen in the 1970s and 1980s, that there is, I think, this really important linkage between sort of anti-tax policy and certain kinds of anti-spending and anti-state politics. But I don't know how to solve it. If I did, I probably wouldn't be teaching history at a small liberal arts college in Lexington, Virginia.
So, Vanessa, you have actually done polling on people's attitudes toward taxes, which I think bears on this question very directly. How do you change people's attitudes about taxation?
So the first thing I'd say is it's important to remember that public policy is not a mirror of public opinion, and we sometimes get that wrong. We imagine that what Americans want is what they get from government. And when you say it out loud, obviously that's clearly not the case on any of a number of things, right? And on a number of issues, people like higher minimum wages, they want various kinds of gun control, and they don't get them. So taxes are another one of those issues where what people think should be, which is the majority of Americans think that wealthy people should pay more in tax if they support progressive taxation. And they see tax paying as one of the responsibilities of citizenship. In fact, Americans overwhelmingly agree that paying taxes is a civic duty, and that not paying your taxes is it's not smart, it's unethical. So if you ask people about that, something like 95% of Americans agree that paying your taxes is a civic duty. So I don't think necessarily that the hearts and minds is the problem. I think the institutions are the problem in this country on so many things. But what I will say is that one thing that I think maybe helps is the recognition that other Americans are actually relatively willing to pay taxes, right? Because there's a kind of a rhetoric that has a lot of salience here in Washington, and in the media about, oh, Americans hate taxes. Americans never want to pay taxes. No one would ever, people will do anything to cheat. Actually, tax compliance in America is very high. Tax morale, which is the sentiment you have about paying your taxes, is very high. And so if we're looking for the problem, I don't think we need to look for it in the sort of basic commitment to tax paying of most Americans.
Can I ask?
Go on.
Oh, sorry.
No.
I'm on that note. I'm curious about, and so do we have it? Oh, we still have Esther's question. Never mind. Let's go to Esther's question.
Okay.
I just feel bad. I will email you guys separately. It's about cash-based businesses.
Esther, you are a scrambled video work of performance art today.
When I was 15, this is what pornography looked like on my
Esther, you are a 15-year-old's image of pornography, but the floor is yours for your question.
No, it's more like those spinning painting discs where the card would spin while you squirted paint onto it. Anyway, my initial question was related to the use of taxation to promote social policy, like marriage, or when we lived in New Zealand, the investment and rental properties. But given the discussion and your suggestion that's not such a positive way to use taxation, we'll go the other way and flip it and say, how do we change that cultural mode of use of taxation towards not connecting the two? What are your first one or two practical steps to really make that shift? It wouldn't be that easy, it seems to me. So I'd love to hear what you have to think about that. Thanks.
Who wants to take that?
My mic, I couldn't hear very well, so I'm going to have to punt.
So the question was, how do we sort of shift from essentially a reliance on tax expenditures and tax spending to do kind of social welfare work? Since I think we both suggested that was maybe not the most efficient and most sort of politically good way of doing it. And I think it's hard, right? Because this is essentially a 100-year-old system now. These kinds of tax privileges are built into the system. We can only look at resistance to getting rid of the state and local tax deduction, getting rid of the home mortgage interest deduction, to suggest the difficulties of doing this kind of work. And of course, I think that folks who would like to talk about simplifying the tax code to get rid of these sort of tax welfare, right, which are generally things that benefit the white, middle, and upper classes, that you need to kind of replace them on the spending side, right? So you don't want to get rid of the home mortgage interest deduction and then zero out all housing spending, right? That there should be a kind of more progressive complement to that. So I don't think it's not as easy as just getting rid of the tax spending, right? You have to change attitudes towards responsibilities of the government, what it is that citizens can expect from the state and what the state can expect from the citizen. And so I don't think it's just a question of tax reform. There has to be a sort of complementary renegotiation, really, of the kind of social contract and what it is that we can expect from each other.
All right, I've got a important critical question for Vanessa, and Kate has an important matter as well to raise before we wrap. Vanessa is in possession of one of the all-time great Brookings plants. Oh. And as I recall, it is a cactus that you raised from a clipping given to you by your grandmother. Mm-hmm. Am I remembering that right?
That is exactly right. That's Mr. Stabby. Yeah.
And you asked me to care for it once when you were on vacation for a few weeks. And I'm just concerned about the plant because we haven't been at Brookings since March, and all the plants in the jungle studio are stone dead. And like every single one of them is dead. And I'm just concerned about Mr. Stabby. So I want an update to make sure that I take it he has a male gender. I just want to make sure he's okay.
So these plants actually came back. So I went on parental leave just before quarantine started. So I had a plan to get my plants out. I did. So my plants are doing great. You can see some of them behind me now. They are all home and doing well. It is so. Mr. Stabby Jr. passed on, unfortunately. That's sad to hear.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah,
but not because of COVID.
Not because of COVID. No,
it was just his time.
Yeah,
it happens. Mm-hmm. Well, that was not the answer I was hoping for, but it's better than the "I abandoned him at Brookings" answer, which is what I feared because it's what's true of all of my plants.
So, did you have a clipping of Mr. Stabby?
Yeah, and I'm afraid clipping grandchild of Mr. Stabby is kaput.
That is too bad to hear.
Kate, you have an important announcement regarding In Lieu of Fun drinkware.
Oh yes. Well, now I finished it, and now it's all full of fingerprints. I'm going to sign it off. Really classy, people. This is the beautiful In Lieu of Fun. If you can hold on.
Wait.
Like
let me.
The reflection is terrible.
Make you take up the whole screen here.
There you go.
It is. Wow. It's got the murder hornet. It's got the baby cannon.
It is pretty great.
Wow.
And I'm loving it. I have one other element of merch to
It
show
is the Lisa Page bag, puppet bag. Wow.
It's pretty incredible. And on the other side, so this is, to you guys, you don't know this, but Lisa Page couldn't be on the show once, and so I made a puppet about her, and it now lives above my head, and it comes on all the time, and it's voiced by the actual Lisa Page, we think. But anyways, they made these bags, and they're pretty outstanding. They have like an internal pocket. The detail's amazing. They have an internal pocket with like a little tiny Lisa Page puppet like logo. Like, it's just great.
The thing is, like, it actually looks like Lisa, which is a testament more to Kate's
my artwork
than to the merch producer. But the merch is awesome. Thanks to all the In Lieu of Fun folk, who are responsible for producing the In Lieu of Fun merch. Tomorrow we are going to have Sarah Bond, who is one of my absolute favorite Twitter presences and is responsible in a weird, indirect kind of way for this show coming together today. She is a classicist at the University of Iowa, and I got into a really interesting conversation with her the other day about ancient Aramaic manuscripts that were much older than I understood Aramaic manuscripts ever to be. And she directed me to some awesome resources on this. If you have any interest in ancient history and you are not following Sarah on Twitter, you are missing a treat. And I've never met her. And so I'm really excited about, though she actually, I should say, for those of you who have either Laffer challenge coins or Baby Cannon challenge coins, she did the Latin translations of both of those, because we only have the best people, as Donald Trump would say, doing translations for Laffer. And so I'm really excited to meet her and sort of talk ancient history. And that will be 22 hours and 51 minutes from now. And until then, Kate?
We don't have fun anymore, but like death, we still have taxes. No. Yes.
I like
it. Fun though they may not be, they sure do make a good hour of conversation. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. This was super